The hospital room smelled of antiseptic and regret. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead, casting a sterile glow on the pale blue walls. Ellen sat on the edge of the stiff bed, her thin frame wrapped in a worn cardigan. At 62, she'd always imagined growing old with grace, hand in hand with her husband, Harold. They'd planned for quiet evenings on their porch, watching the world soften into twilight. Instead, she was here, alone, staring at the foredrip that tethered her to the present. The diagnosis: breast cancer had come 3 months ago, a cruel intruder that upended her life. But it wasn't the disease that broke her heart. It was Harold. They'd been married for 37 years. 37 years of shared coffee in the mornings, of arguments over forgotten anniversaries, of laughter over their grandchildren's antics. Harold had always been the steady one, the man who fixed things: leaky faucets, broken dreams, her own doubts. When the doctor delivered the news, his hand had been warm in hers, his voice steady as he promised. "We'll get through this, Ellie. Together." She believed him. She'd always believed him. But 2 weeks ago, Harold stopped coming to the hospital. At first, it was excuses: a meeting at the auto shop, a late delivery of parts for his precious car collection. Ellen didn't mind at first. She knew how much those cars meant to him. His garage was a shrine to chrome and steel, a collection of vintage Mustangs, Corvettes, and a rare 1967 Shelby Cobra he'd spent decades restoring. He'd spent more hours polishing those cars than he had with her some years. But she'd never resented it. It was his passion, his escape. She'd loved him enough to let him have it. Then the excuses stopped. So did his calls. When she finally reached him, his voice was distant, clipped. "I can't do this, Ellen," he'd said over the phone, his words slicing through her like a scalpel. "I can't watch you fade. I'm sorry." The line went dead, and with it, something inside her. She'd sat there, clutching the hospital phone, her chemo-weakened body trembling not from the drugs, but from the betrayal. Harold, her rock, her partner, had abandoned her when she needed him most. The days that followed blurred into a haze of pain and disbelief. Nurses came and went, their kind smiles unable to fill the void. Friends stopped by, offering casseroles and platitudes, but their pity only deepened her isolation. Ellen didn't want their food or their tears. She wanted answers. She wanted Harold. She wanted to know why the man who'd vowed to love her in sickness and in health had chosen to run. One evening, as the sunset painted the hospital window in hues of orange and pink, Ellen made a decision. She wasn't going to let Harold's cowardice define her. She wasn't going to let cancer, or him, strip her of her dignity. If he could walk away from their life, she could take something from him, too. Something that would hurt as much as his absence did. His cars. Those gleaming, soulless machines he loved more than her. She didn't have a plan. Not really. But the thought of selling his collection off, turning his pride into dust, lit a fire in her chest. It wasn't about money, though the hospital bills were piling up. It was about reclaiming something for herself. About proving she was still here. Still fighting. Ellen wasn't just a sick woman abandoned by her husband. She was a force, and she would make him feel it. The next morning, she called her nephew, Mark, a tech-savvy 30-year-old who'd always had a soft spot for her. "I need your help," she told him, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "I want to sell Harold's cars. All of them. Fast." Mark hesitated, his voice crackling over the phone. "Aunt Ellen, are you sure? Those cars, they're worth a fortune. And Uncle Harold, he's gone." She cut him off. "He left me here. I'm done waiting for him." Mark arrived at the hospital that afternoon, his laptop tucked under his arm. He looked at her with a mix of concern and admiration, his brown eyes searching her face. "You're serious about this?" he said. "Not a question." She nodded, her jaw tight. "I've never been more serious about anything." He didn't argue. Instead, he opened his laptop and started typing, pulling up websites for car auctions, collectors' forums, and private buyers. Ellen watched, her heart pounding with a mix of fear and exhilaration. This was reckless, maybe even spiteful, but it felt right. It felt like justice. By evening, they had a plan. Mark would list the cars online, using photos from Harold's meticulously kept albums. They'd target collectors across the country, offering the cars at prices just low enough to spark a bidding frenzy, but high enough to reflect their value. The Shelby Cobra alone could fetch $500,000. Ellen didn't care about the money. Not really. She cared about the message it would send. Harold had taken her love, her trust, her future. She would take his legacy. As Mark worked, Ellen leaned back in her hospital bed, her eyes drifting to the window. The world outside was moving on, indifferent to her pain. But she wasn't invisible. Not yet. She thought of the garage, of the cars gleaming under fluorescent lights, each one a monument to Harold's ego. She imagined them gone, scattered to new owners, their absence a gaping wound in his life. For the first time in weeks, she smiled. The garage was colder than Ellen remembered. When Mark drove her there after her hospital discharge, the air felt sharp, like it was holding its breath. The cars stood in perfect rows, their polished surfaces reflecting the overhead lights like mirrors. The 1967 Shelby Cobra sat in the center, its black paint gleaming with an almost menacing intensity. Ellen's chest tightened as she walked past it, her cane tapping softly against the concrete floor. This was Harold's kingdom, his sanctuary, and she was about to burn it down. Mark had worked fast. Within 48 hours of their hospital conversation, he'd posted listings for every car in Harold's collection. The response was overwhelming. Collectors from California to New York flooded Mark's inbox with inquiries, their messages a mix of awe and urgency. Ellen sat beside him at the kitchen table, her oxygen tank humming softly at her side, as he read the offers aloud. "This guy's offering $450. 000 for the Cobra," Mark said, his eyebrows raised. "Another one wants the '69 Mustang for $120. 000. Sight unseen." Ellen nodded, her lips pressed into a thin line. "Keep going," she said. "All of them." She wasn't naive. She knew selling the cars overnight was ambitious, maybe impossible. But the momentum felt unstoppable, like a wave she'd set in motion. Mark suggested hosting an impromptu auction at the garage, inviting the most serious buyers to bid in person. "It'll drive up the prices," he explained. "Collectors get competitive when they're in the same room." Ellen agreed, though the idea of strangers invading Harold's space made her stomach churn. She wanted this, but it didn't mean it was easy. The auction was set for the following evening. Mark handled the logistics, contacting buyers, arranging security, even hiring a local auctioneer who owed him a favor. Ellen spent the day preparing, not just for the sale, but for what it meant. She wore her favorite scarf, a soft green one Harold had bought her years ago, before everything fell apart. It was a small act of defiance, wrapping herself in his gift while she dismantled his world. When the first buyers arrived, Ellen stood at the edge of the garage, her frail frame dwarfed by the towering presence of the cars. Men in tailored suits and women with sharp eyes wandered through the collection, their whispers filled with reverence. "Look at that Cobra," one man said, running a hand along its hood. "A masterpiece." Ellen wanted to snap at him, to tell him it was just metal, just a thing. But she stayed silent. her hands clasped tightly around her cane. The auction began at dusk. The auctioneer, a wiry man with a booming voice, stood on a makeshift platform, rattling off numbers like a preacher delivering a sermon. Bids climbed higher, faster than Ellen had expected. The Mustang went for $150. 000. A Corvette fetched $200. 000. The Cobra sparked a bidding war, the price soaring past $600. 000 before a man in a cowboy hat slammed his paddle down, claiming it for $675. 000. Ellen watched, her heart a strange mix of triumph and grief. Each sale felt like a piece of Harold being stripped away, but it also felt like freedom. By midnight, the garage was nearly empty. Only a few cars remained, their fates sealed by online bids that would finalize in the morning. Mark stood beside her, his arm around her shoulders. "You did it, Aunt Ellen," he said softly. "You really did it." She nodded, but the weight of it all pressed down on her. The money, millions, by Mark's estimate, meant little. It was the act itself, the defiance, that mattered. She'd taken something back. But as the last buyer drove away, Ellen's thoughts turned to Harold. Where was he? Did he know what she'd done? She pictured him walking into the empty garage, his face crumpling as he realized his collection was gone. Part of her wanted to see that moment, to witness his pain. Another part of her, the part that still loved him, despite everything, ached at the thought. She pushed it away. He didn't deserve her sympathy. Mark drove her back to the house, the silence between them heavy but not uncomfortable. "What now?" he asked as they pulled into the driveway. Ellen stared at the dark windows of the home she'd shared with Harold for decades. "Now," she said, "I keep fighting." She meant the cancer, the loneliness, the betrayal. Selling the cars was just the beginning. She wasn't done yet. The news reached Harold by morning. Ellen didn't see his reaction, but she could imagine it. Mark had forwarded her a text from a mutual friend. "Harold's losing it. Says you sold his cars. Is it true?" Ellen didn't respond. Let him stew, she thought. Let him feel what it's like to lose something you love. She was back in the hospital for another round of chemo, the Ford dripping steadily into her arm. The nausea was worse this time, a relentless wave that left her curled up in bed, her body betraying her even as her spirit burned. But the fire from selling the cars hadn't faded. If anything, it grew stronger. She'd done something unthinkable, something Harold would never have expected from the quiet, accommodating wife he'd known. And that gave her power. Mark visited daily, bringing updates on the sales. The final cars had been shipped to their new owners, and the money was deposited into a new account Ellen had opened in her name. "You've got enough to cover the hospital bills, and then some," Mark said, his voice tinged with pride. "You could buy a house, travel, anything." Ellen shook her head. "It's not about the money," she said. It never was. She didn't tell him what she was planning next. The idea had come to her in the sleepless hours after the auction, when the adrenaline faded and the reality of her situation settled in. Harold's betrayal wasn't just personal, it was a theft of their shared life, their shared dreams. She wanted to reclaim more than just his cars. She wanted to reclaim herself. Ellen started small. She asked Mark to bring her old journals from the attic, the ones she'd kept in her 20s before marriage and motherhood consumed her. The pages were yellowed. The ink faded. But her younger self leaped from them vibrant, curious, unafraid. She'd wanted to be a writer once, to tell stories that moved people. Harold had encouraged her. But life got in the way. Kids, bills, his cars. She'd let her dreams slip, convinced they were less important than his. Now, reading those journals, she saw how much she'd given up. She began writing again, in the margins of hospital notepads, then on a laptop Mark brought her. At first, it was just fragments memories of her marriage, the pain of Harold's abandonment, the thrill of selling the cars. But the fragments grew into something more, a story. Her story. She wrote about love and loss, about resilience and revenge. The words poured out, raw and unpolished, but alive. For the first time in years, Ellen felt like she was creating something, not just surviving. Her doctors noticed the change. "You're fighting harder, Dr. Patel said during a checkup, her eyes warm with approval. "Your numbers are looking better." Ellen didn't know if it was the chemo or the writing or the sheer stubbornness that kept her going. But she felt stronger. Not physically, her body was still frail. Her hair gone. Her skin pale, but mentally, she was rebuilding herself, piece by piece. Mark helped her set up a blog, a simple site where she could share her writing. "You don't have to publish it," he said. "Just see how it feels." But Ellen wanted to be heard. She posted her first piece, titled "What Cancer Took and What I Took Back." It was raw, unsparing, a recounting of Harold's betrayal and her act of defiance. She didn't expect much, just a way to release the words into the world. But within hours, comments flooded in. Strangers shared their own stories of abandonment, of illness, of reclaiming their lives. "You're an inspiration," one woman wrote. "I sold my ex's golf clubs after he cheated. Thank you for reminding me I'm not alone." Ellen read the comments through tears, her heart swelling. She wasn't alone either. For every Harold, there were others out there fighting, surviving, refusing to be broken. She wrote more, each piece a step toward healing. The blog grew, drawing thousands of readers. Local news picked up her story, calling her the Car Widow, a nickname she hated but couldn't shake. She didn't care about the fame. She cared about the connection, the sense that her pain had purpose. Harold called her a week later. She hadn't heard his voice since that awful night on the hospital phone. "Ellen," he said, his voice thick with anger and something else, regret. "Maybe. How could you do this? Those cars were my life." She let the silence stretch, savoring his desperation. "You were my life," she said finally, her voice steady. "You chose to leave." She hung up before he could respond, her hands shaking but her heart calm. She'd said what she needed to say. Now, she had a story to keep writing. Ellen's blog became a lifeline. Each post was a thread connecting her to others, a reminder that her voice mattered. She wrote late into the night, the hospital's quiet hum her only companion. Her stories weren't just about the cars or Harold's betrayal. They were about the small victories, the way she'd smiled at her reflection despite the scars, the way she'd laughed with Mark over a bad hospital meal, the way she'd found strength in the wreckage of her life. Readers responded with their own stories, creating a community of survivors who refused to be defined by their pain. But the cancer wasn't done with her. A scan showed new shadows, small but persistent, in her lungs. Dr. Patel sat her down, her face gentle but serious. "We can try a new treatment," she said. "It's aggressive, but it could buy you time." Ellen nodded, her mind racing. Time. That's what she needed now, not for herself, but for the work she'd started. The blog, the community, the story she was still writing. She wasn't ready to let go. Mark was there when she got the news, his face pale but resolute. "Whatever you need, Aunt Ellen," he said. "I'm here." She squeezed his hand, grateful for his loyalty. He'd become more than a Nephilim partner, a confidant, the son she'd never had. Together, they planned the next steps. The money from the car sales covered her treatment. But Ellen wanted to do more. She wanted to give back, to use her story to help others. She started a fundraiser on her blog, calling it Wheels for Warriors. The name was a nod to the cars. But the mission was bigger, to support women battling cancer alone, abandoned by partners or families. The response was staggering. Donations poured in, along with messages of gratitude and solidarity. Ellen worked with a local nonprofit to distribute the funds, ensuring they reached women who needed them most, women like her, fighting not just illness but betrayal. The work gave her purpose, but it couldn't erase the pain of Harold's absence. Late at night, when the hospital was quiet, Ellen would lie awake, wondering where he was. Had he started over somewhere new? Was he haunted by what he'd done? She didn't know, and part of her didn't want to. But another part, the part that still remembered their good years, ached for closure. She hated that part of herself, the part that still loved him. It felt like weakness, but she was learning it wasn't. It was human. One afternoon, a letter arrived at the hospital. The handwriting was unmistakable, Harold's tight, slanted script. Ellen stared at it, her heart pounding. She didn't want to open it, didn't want to let him back into her head. But curiosity won. She tore the envelope open, her hands trembling. Ellen, the letter began. I don't expect you to forgive me. I don't forgive myself. I was a coward, and I failed you. The cars, they were all I had left after I lost you. I know that sounds pathetic, but it's true. I'm not asking for a second chance. I just needed you to know I'm sorry. She read it again, then again, her emotions a tangle of anger and grief. Sorry. The word felt hollow after everything. She wanted to burn the letter, to tear it to pieces. Instead, she tucked it into her journal, a reminder of what she'd overcome. Harold's apology didn't change what he'd done. It didn't change her. She wrote about the letter in her next blog post, not to vilify him, but to explore the complexity of forgiveness. I don't know if I'll ever forgive him, she wrote, but I'm learning to forgive myself for loving him, for trusting him, for believing we'd be forever. That's the hardest part, letting go of the life you thought you'd have. The post resonated with thousands, sparking conversations about healing and resilience. Ellen realized her story wasn't just hers anymore. It belonged to everyone who'd ever been broken and kept going. As the weeks passed, her health stabilized. The new treatment was grueling, but it was working. She gained weight. Her color returned, and her energy crept back. She started planning for the future, not the distant one she'd once imagined with Harold, but a new one, built on her own terms. She wanted to expand Wheels for Warriors, maybe turn it into a full-fledged charity. She wanted to keep writing, to keep connecting. She wanted to live. Ellen's hospital room was no longer a prison. It was a workspace, a sanctuary, a place where she rebuilt herself. The laptop Mark had given her sat on the tray table, its screen glowing with her latest blog post. Wheels for Warriors was growing, with donations now in the tens of thousands. Women from across the country reached out, some to thank her, others to ask for help. Ellen read every message, responded to as many as she could. Each one reminded her why she was fighting, not just for herself, but for them. Her health was a fragile balance. The new treatment kept the cancer at bay, but the side effects were relentless. Nausea, fatigue, and pain were her constant companions. But she refused to let them win. She'd started physical therapy to regain her strength, taking slow, deliberate steps down the hospital halls. Mark cheered her on, joking that she'd be running marathons soon. She laughed, but the idea of moving forward, step by step, felt right. One morning, a reporter from a national magazine contacted her. They wanted to feature her story, to tell the world about the woman who sold her husband's car collection and turned her pain into purpose. Ellen hesitated. She didn't want the spotlight, didn't want to be the car widow. But Mark convinced her. This could help more people. He said, your story's bigger than you now. She agreed, on the condition that the article focus on Wheels for Warriors. Not just her. The interview was exhausting but empowering. Ellen spoke openly about her diagnosis, Harold's abandonment, and the night she decided to sell the cars. She talked about the women she'd met through her blog, their stories of resilience mirroring her own. The reporter, a kind woman with sharp questions, asked if she'd heard from Harold since the letter. No, Ellen said, her voice steady. And I don't need to. It was true. His absence no longer defined her. The article was published a month later, accompanied by a photo of Ellen in her hospital room, her face lit with quiet determination. The response was overwhelming. Donations to Wheels for Warriors doubled, and Ellen's blog crashed from the traffic. Strangers sent letters, some handwritten, others emailed, sharing their own battles. A woman in Ohio wrote about leaving an abusive husband. A man in Texas shared how his wife's cancer had brought them closer, not torn them apart. Ellen kept every letter, a testament to the community she'd built. But not everyone was kind. Some online comments called her vindictive, accusing her of destroying Harold's life out of spite. Those cars were his dream. One person wrote, "You had no right." Ellen read the criticism, her heart stinging but unbroken. She knew the truth. She hadn't sold the cars to hurt Harold. She'd sold them to save herself. And she'd do it again. One evening, as she was drafting a new blog post, Mark burst into the room, his face alight with excitement. "You won't believe this," he said, holding up his phone. A major car collector had reached out, offering to donate a vintage car to Wheels for Warriors for a charity auction. "He read your story," Mark said. "He wants to help." Ellen laughed. A real, full laugh that felt like a gift. The irony wasn't lost on Hera Carr, the symbol of her pain, now a tool for good. She threw herself into planning the charity auction, working with Mark and the nonprofit to make it a reality. They set a date, booked a venue, and spread the word through her blog. The event would be a celebration, not just of her survival, but of every woman who'd fought alone. Ellen envisioned a night of hope, of music and laughter and stories shared. She wanted the women she'd helped to be there, to see what they'd built together. As the auction approached, Ellen's health took a turn. A fever landed her in intensive care, her body struggling under the strain of treatment. For a few dark days, she wondered if she'd make it to the event. But she fought, as she always had, drawing strength from the community she'd created. When the fever broke, she felt a quiet triumph. She was still here. The night of the auction, Ellen stood on a small stage, her cane steady in her hand. The room was filled with faces, some familiar, some strangers, all connected by her story. The donated car, a gleaming 1957 Chevy Bel Air, stood at the center, a symbol of transformation. As the bids climbed, Ellen's heart swelled. This wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about rebuilding, about turning loss into something beautiful. The auction was a triumph. The Chevy Bel Air sold for $200. 000. Every penny going to Wheels for Warriors. Ellen watched from the stage, her eyes shining with tears she didn't try to hide. The room erupted in applause as the final bid was called. But for Ellen, the real victory was the women in the crowd, survivors, fighters, women who'd found hope in her story. They'd come from across the country, some with their own scars, others with stories still unfolding. Ellen met each one, listening to their journeys, holding their hands. She wasn't alone anymore. In the weeks that followed, Wheels for Warriors grew into a movement. The nonprofit expanded, hiring staff to manage the growing donations and outreach. Ellen became its heart, though she insisted she was just one part of it. She continued writing, her blog a beacon for those navigating pain and betrayal, Her health remained fragile, but she refused to let it define her. Each day was a gift, and she spent it fiercely writing, connecting, fighting. Harold reached out again, this time through a mutual friend. He wanted to meet, to talk. Ellen considered it, but only for a moment. She didn't need his explanations or his apologies. She'd built a life without him, one richer than she'd ever imagined. She sent a simple message back. I wish you well, but I'm done. It was closure. Not for him, but for her. One sunny afternoon, Ellen sat in her garden, a new addition to the house she'd bought with the car money. It was small, nothing like the sprawling home she'd shared with Harold, but it was hers. Flowers bloomed around her, their colors vibrant against the green. Mark was there, tinkering with a laptop, planning the next phase of Wheels for Warriors. You ever think about slowing down? He asked, half joking. Ellen smiled, her eyes crinkling. Not yet, she said. There's too much to do. Her latest blog post was about gratitude, not the shallow kind, but the hard-won sort that comes from surviving the unthinkable. She wrote about the women she'd met, the strength they'd given her, the way pain could forge something unbreakable. Cancer took my health, she wrote. My husband took my trust, but I took back my life, and I'm not giving it up. The post went viral, shared across platforms, translated into languages she couldn't read. Ellen didn't care about the numbers. She cared about the messages that followed, stories of women starting over, of men rethinking their choices, of families healing. Her story had become a mirror, reflecting the resilience in others. She'd sold Harold's cars to reclaim her power, but what she'd gained was so much more. As the sun set, Ellen closed her laptop and leaned back in her chair. The garden smelled of lavender and earth, a reminder of life's quiet beauty. She thought of Harold, briefly, but not with anger. He was a chapter, not the whole story. Her story was still being written, and it was hers alone. She didn't know how much time she had left. The cancer was still there, a shadow that might never fully fade. But she wasn't afraid. She'd faced the worst betrayal, illness, the loss of the life she'd known, and she'd come out stronger. She'd built something new, something that would outlast her. Wheels for Warriors would continue. Her words would live on, and the women she'd inspired would carry the torch. Ellen looked at Mark, who was grinning at something on his phone. What's so funny? She asked. He showed her a meme cartoon of a woman selling a car with a mischievous grin. Captioned, "The car widow strikes again." Ellen laughed, the sound carrying across the garden. She wasn't just the car widow. She was Ellen. Survivor. Writer. Warrior. And she was just getting started.